Be realistic, demand the impossible, a utopian dream for many centuries. Thinking about utopian cities and trying to deliver utopian ideas about cities has been a key part of our Festival of the Future City work. Niall Kishtainy is the author of A Little History of Economics, which we've used extensively in our Festival of Economics work, and also the book we are talking about today, The Infinite City, Utopian Dreams on the Streets of London. In addition to being a writer, Niall has worked in government, in journalism, and in academia. Niall, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Andrew. Great to be with you.
Can we talk about the idea of utopia and cities to begin with? You mention in the book that utopia finds its place in the heart of the metropolis.
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, in a way, we can go back to the old Lewis Mumford, who was a great historian of the city and utopias in the early 20th century, middle 20th century, who said, you know, the people creating cities, the first cities that humans created was a kind of an example of a kind of utopian leap in a way, a kind of shift in consciousness that led to this leap in civilization. So in a sense, he ties the kind of utopian propensity to things that people were doing really at the dawn of humanity, if you like, well, the dawn of civilization anyway. But then later on, as utopian literature developed, so particularly kind of the Renaissance utopias of people like Thomas More, they're very much framed in terms of perfect cities or these kind of walled, perfect societies. We'll talk about this problem of perfection perhaps later on, but this idea of utopian dreaming being sort of indelibly linked to the creation of cities and how new social arrangements and new ways of people relating to each other can arise from the creation of cities and the imagining of cities. So this connection between utopian dreaming and cities, you know, goes back a long way. I mean, a long way in the tradition. Later on, that becomes a bit more complicated. So as you get into the sort of late 18th century, 19th century, an anxiety emerges about the city. Of course, you start to get development of, you know, industrial cities, big capitalist cities, so London and Manchester, and the city starts to be seen as something kind of more darker and infernal. And then the relationship between utopia and the city becomes more complicated. Again, there's another theme that we might pick up later on perhaps in the conversation, but you know, the rise then of romanticism and actually wanting to sort of flee from the city and create a sort of rural idyll away from the city. So it's a kind of complex, dynamic relationship, I think. But yeah, the idea of the city being really embedded in utopian dreaming, I think it's an idea that's been in the tradition for centuries.
Do you think that one of the issues there, and we'll talk about the romantics wanting to get away from cities and this idea of perfection later, but this myth of a lost Arcadia, you know, this even you know the extent of which the Garden City movement did of bringing the country to the city. Do you think there's a complication about this in terms of the way we think about rural and urban places as well as utopias?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that is that is when things get more complex, if you like, when there is a kind of disillusion starts to set in about what city life is. So, you know, with the Industrial Revolution, the mushrooming of these large, much more complex kinds of cities than had been theorized about by utopians in the sort of pre-industrial period. And so there is then this what arises a kind of nostalgic yearning and a desire to escape the city. And there you see this perhaps a kind of reintroduction more powerfully of this idea of the golden age, which was an important source for utopias, but starts to take on a slightly different tone or hue in the 19th century, where people are using that as a way of thinking about escaping from these sort of infernal cities, and then particularly got this move to American communitarian ventures that then start to really take off at that time. So it becomes a much more complex sort of picture, I think. Yeah.
And while we're on this, we might as well talk about the Romantics, because there's this connection with Bristol, with Wordsworth and Coleridge, and then writing the lyrical ballads partly in the city and publishing it here. But they had this idea for their own utopian community in America, the Pantisocracy, which would have been a fine place to live generally, unless you were a woman, because they would be tended to do a lot of the work and so on. But you have this view that the growth of Romanticism, of wanting to, a reaction against the growing industrialization, and a wish to get away from that.
Absolutely. I mean, that in a way, the Pantisocracy is a classic example of that. I think it was sort of in the 1790s.
That's correct. Yeah.
Or somewhere like that. Yeah. I mean, an interesting example of, there are these different threads in Utopia. There's a sort of literary thread of storytelling, and then there's actually the more practical thread of setting up communities. And here you've got that sort of those two things coming together with these poets dreaming of this new kind of commune or small society that they wanted to create, and then actually made unsuccessfully. As I think originally they wanted to go to America, and then they said, okay, America's too tricky, let's do it in Wales, and then they all fell out, and it was a sort of debacle. But yeah, definitely part of that romantic sort of disillusion with the city and wanting to create a sort of little agricultural communitarian system, and so on. So very, very much an archetypal sort of venture at that time. And many, many more examples of it going into the 19th century, actually.
I think one of the great values of this book is the way that you show how relevant utopian ideas are to the city then, throughout time, but also to the city now, which we'll come on to. But before we do that, can we talk about how we think about utopia? You quote, and again, there's a nice Bristol connection here, the academic writer Ruth Levitas, about how to think about utopia. She talks about utopia as method, utopian archaeology, and utopian ontology. Just talk us through those.
Yeah, so I think it's a really useful framework. So often, again, this is a thing we might pick up again, but often utopia is thought of as a quest for something that's perfect, and that once it's done, it's finished and it's static. And actually that quickly in fact that's a sort of straw man, and that quickly leads to that's naive and impossible and so on. There are these Ruth Levitas, one example, thinkers trying to figure out how you use utopia in a much more open-ended sort of way. So she talks about utopia as much more of a kind of process, a set of methods for bringing social yearnings into the present, into reality, thinking how we engage with them, thinking how we use utopia as this process, as this it's not a destination, it's a sort of journey that we're on. So she's got various sort of elements that make up her sort of way of doing this. So one is utopian archaeology. So this is the idea that actually utopian ideas are often embedded in all sorts of political programs, even ones that we would, or certainly present themselves as non-utopian. They present themselves as pragmatic. So you might think of, liberalism or meritocracy, these kinds of things, free markets, for example, very sort of mainstream, so-called pragmatic ways of regulating society. But actually underneath those, there's often a sort of idealized vision. So one part of this sort of utopian process is to try and excavate those things, so kind of archaeology, and to bring them into proper public debate and say, okay, what is the vision behind this particular way of looking at society? And then because if we don't do that, they kind of get imposed by default. Oh, this is just a pragmatic there is no alternative type of argument. Yeah, we just have to have austerity, we just have to have neoliberalism. That's just sort of an economic law of gravity, if you like. So it's a way of sort of challenging that. And other threads would be what she calls utopian ontology. So thinking about what is the vision of human flourishing that has to be part of utopian dreaming. What kinds of people do we want to be? How do we want to relate to each other? Those kinds of things. So thinking about those in more sort of conscious ways. So therefore seeing Utopia as much more of a kind of exploration as a process, not a blueprint that's going to be imposed and then nothing else has to sort of happen. Yeah.
I mean, whenever I've spoken to Ruth, and we did a series of lectures for the 500th anniversary of Thomas More's Utopia. Ruth was one of the speakers there, is about this process, is about this journey. You still have the vision of human flourishing, and you still have lots of things you can build on, but it's the idea of the process you go through rather than the blueprint itself. And I think it means you do achieve some things. You might not achieve the lot, but you do achieve some things through that.
Yeah, and I think that's been sort of understood in the utopian tradition for a long time, even by people who are sometimes considered, not to have understood that. So even, William Morris, who's considered that, often seen as someone with this blueprint, but, there's a famous quote, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but he sort of says, when you get to this utopia, you get there and you realize it's not quite what you imagined it to be, or things have changed and you have to kind of cast off again and get to the, do it again. So it's a constant kind of reimagining. And I think that's the way to think of it.
The other thing which comes across very strongly in the book in terms of thinking about utopias, I think, is about observing the city. And you talk about, for example, Henry Mayhew taking a balloon ride over London. People, Dickens went out to observe the city. And that's something we've been stressing very much as well, that if you want to understand cities and particularly think about their future, is obviously talk to people, but to just wander around, understand where the city is, where it's come from, what are the problems that the city is facing and the challenges, and what are the hopes that people have.
Absolutely. I mean, that was certainly that was the way I wrote the book, actually, was by doing a lot of walking around London. So it was a kind of, it was a combination of drawing on history and literature, but actually seeing how that plays out in the real lived environment of the city. So I think that's really important. Yes, sometimes utopia is can feel very sort of theoretical and sort of abstract. But an important part of it is looking at the city. I'm thinking of some. I mean, this is not actually. I don't really cover Marx too much in the book, but for complicated reasons. But you've got that very famous bit of Marxist literature, "The Condition of the Working Class in England" by Friedrich Engels, which was basically going around Manchester,
absolutely
looking at just really looking at a grassroots at a very grassroots level. What are things like for people in the city? And yes, as you say, people like Henry Mayhew, not a utopian. I present him as a sort of everyman kind of consciousness or conscience of the city, rather than someone with kind of utopian plans, but going out into London and finding these new areas that had been sort of hidden, places like Jacob's Island and some of the slums that were kind of a bit hidden from sort of middle-class Londoners, and how that created a kind of desire to remake the city and to reform, and triggered all sorts of sort of anxieties among reformers and wanting to do something about it. So I think that's a really important part of the story.
And before we come on to some of the specific people you talk about, this notion of social dreaming, of imagination, and how critical that is to this. I mean, I see it now in some organisations, for example, in Bristol, who are working in inner city areas on innovative housing projects. I see it in organisations in Birmingham. There's an organisation called Civic Square, who are new ways of organising in places and so on. But underpinning it is this idea of some kind of dreaming to make the place better for, and particularly with, people. And that's been an element of utopian thinking throughout, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think yes, and I think a sort of key element of it. So you can think about, yes, city design and the design of buildings and so on, and create beautiful plans, etc. But I think a really key part of utopia is how do people relate to each other. So what is community? What is connection? What is belonging about? And that really has to be a part of it. So it can't be just, it's not just creating a beautiful city plan, or it's about it. That is often a part of it, but it's about how does that reorganization of space or whatever, how does that trigger new kinds of ways of relating, and new ways of dealing with each other. And I mean, I think that has to run through the Utopian project, even if you're thinking about the environment and climate change, for example. It's not just enough to think about sort of technical solutions. We have to think about, you know, how has this come about? How has this problem come about as a result of perhaps a failure of relating or failure of working together? So how do you sort of reconstitute people's relationships and so on? So that has to be really central to it, I think. Otherwise, you get things like sort of technological utopianism, sort of Silicon Valley utopianism, or we'll find some great sort of technological hack, and then everything will be fine. That's not really utopianism in the way that I see it, anyway.
Yeah. Let's start with looking at some of the people, and you cover a vast range of people, some of whom I knew a lot about, some of whom were new to me, which is always the great value of a book like this, I think. But let's start with perhaps the most obvious one, which is Thomas More and his Utopia. And what did that say about the city for you, Thomas More?
Well, so he was very much writing on the. I mean, it was a great way to start the story because, of course, he invented the word utopia. So it's a lovely sort of narrative starting point. But also, more than that, he was writing really in the context of London that's really on the cusp of. So the book was 1515. So London really on the cusp of sort of turning into this sort of modern commercial city and becoming really a European, on its sort of trajectory to becoming kind of European heavyweight city and becoming the sort of leading commercial city, turning into this big sort of capitalist behemoth eventually. And he was seeing the kind of tensions that were arising because of that. So this fast commercialization, the enclosures, the beginning of enclosures of land and so on. So it's really casting a critical eye over that. And so I think that's really what's in terms of how it relates to London, that's the sort of connection. I mean, interestingly, the Utopia that he wrote isn't set in London. It's on an island, probably somewhere in the New World. So this was a period in utopian writing where it's very much about projecting society not into the future, but often geographically distanced into the New World. But the town that he talks about on this island has all these sort of echoes of London, I think. So it's really a kind of renovated, morally righteous London that he's sort of envisioning there.
And you write in the book about how he created his own mini utopia at home, the way they lived and what they talked about and so on.
Yeah, that's right. So this was later. He moved to Chelsea, had this lovely sort of manor house with gardens running down to the river, and it's often it's one part, obviously more as a sort of legendary character, and sort of one part of his legend was this idea, this domestic humanist idyll that he had by the river with, Erasmus dropping by for a bit of philosophical discussion, and his children being taught, Latin and this sort of having this sort of humanist education, and him sort of helping the poor in the lanes around and so on. That's very much part of that legend of Thomas.
So More wrote about Utopia, and the next group I want to talk about is Gerard Winstanley and the Diggers, who actually tried to deliver a utopian community. You talk about this was a watershed in the thinking about utopia.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess Thomas More's Utopia is very much a Renaissance sort of utopia that really wasn't. He certainly wasn't trying to sort of create. He wasn't trying to gather a band of followers to create at all. He was very much from a kind of elite, very high up in the elite power structure. He's sort of Catholic and definitely not a revolutionary.
It's 11:30.
Winstanley comes along, things have started to, Utopia it's started to really connect a bit more. I mean, this happens much more sort of in the 18th century, but starting to connect to the idea of progress and actually humans being able to create better kinds of institutions, and actually gathered a band of followers and started to try and create his utopia. So it was a very, yes, it was a watershed. It was a very different kind of world, imaginative world to that of Thomas More. But the idea that humans, through their own efforts, could kind of renovate the world and create a better society, more righteous kingdom, if you like.
And you talk about, what they talked about, the notion of working together and eating together, the earth as a common treasury, and no dominion or lordship. These are, important foundations, I think, of thinking about this whole issue.
That's right. So it was work. What was the phrase was, work together, eat together. The earth as a common treasury. So yes, so the idea of a new form of sort of reciprocity, new forms of sort of solidarity, and trying to do this, actually sort of left. This is another theme in sort of London utopia, sometimes a sort of retreating slightly from the city to try and create something outside the sort of infernal city. So he went out to Surrey, to Cobham, and tried to create this little sort of colony that was attempting to essentially sow vegetables on this hill, and gather followers. So he was someone who'd suffered he was suffering he was originally a merchant in the city, but suffered economic losses during the Civil War, and so sort of in a sense left the city and wrote a lot of sort of wrote a vitriolic text saying, I was cheated out of the city by all this thieving and this sort of unjust economy, and tried to create a new system outside of London.
Yeah, I mean, the opposition that he found, and there was, strong opposition to him. How symptomatic is that, do you think, of people who do try and introduce these new ways of working? And right through time, really, you talk about the protest movements, the reclaim the street movements later on in the book, more recent times, which had their own opposition as well. How difficult is it to try and deliver these things in the face of that kind of opposition?
It is difficult, and I mean, I think clearly utopias are trying to often challenge power and challenge dominant forms of social organization and how the economy functions and so on. It's going to generate opposition. So a lot of these movements that I talk about in the book did generate opposition in different ways. I mean, in Winstanley's case, it's essentially getting beaten up by local gentry and farmers and so on. But in other movements, in sort of different ways, sort of more like sort of government repression and imprisonment and so on. Other utopian movements are sort of interesting. I mean, Robert Owen is quite an interesting one in the 19th century in that he's much more able to kind of negotiate with power and do something that feels much more politically, how should you say, sort of in a sense, he manages to use power to his advantage. So he gets quite a lot of even members of the royal family to sort of support what he's trying to do in terms of building these little communities. I mean, some have criticized him for that, saying he sort of compromised with power. So not all utopians are these sort of pugnacious and oppositional sort of figures. And then you've got the Garden City utopias as well, again, feel very sort of different, but often they do generate opposition, and you see that now in some of the modern sort of contemporary, what I would call utopian movements involved in the environment, and see what the kind of response from the government has been now to that. So
before I come on to the movement around housing and so on and garden cities, I just want to ask you about a couple of other figures that you talk about who were new to me, and both were related in time as well. Thomas Spence and Robert Wedderburn.
Yeah.
I mean, Spence is the kind of person you'd have liked to have met, partly because he created this whole new language, or tried to create a new language, and rewrote Robinson Crusoe, for example, in this new language. And
yeah.
But Wedderburn was also very interesting, wasn't he? Because of his, you write about his, he almost like a forerunner of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yes. So yes. So Spence was this very sort of truculent, fiery utopian who kind of gathered this these utopian followers, created these utopian movements in the sort of alleys of Holborn and Soho. This was in the 1790s, so very much in the context of the French Revolution, and so wanting to have a revolution in England. And Robert Wedderburn was one of his followers, but eventually kind of created his own little utopian movement using the model of a sort of dissenting chapel. So he had a sort of hayloft in Soho that his followers would come to, and it was this sort of extraordinary kind of utopian radical sort of theatre. I mean, as a sort of a preaching loft, he was kind of propagating a kind of form of Spenceanism. So this was to do with the local ownership of land, but also giving it a much more kind of anti-slavery Atlanticist kind of hue, saying that the planters in the colonies and the factory owners in Britain are kind of the same ilk. They're both using black people and working class people as sort of fodder for sort of global capitalism, this sort of idea. I mean, was eventually imprisoned, but an extraordinary character. And a sort of forerunner of. He certainly wasn't trying to. One thing that's interesting about him, he wasn't trying to take on the sort of norm of respectability. He was very much, rejecting that and saying that this isn't about the injustices, about society, and the solution is not about just the individual bettering themselves. It's about a broader sort of structural violence and injustice. So very much looking forward to sort of the Black Power movements of the 20th century, and Black Lives Matter and those contemporary movements, but really quite a neglected figure, actually. Not that well known, unfortunately. You
write about the kind of golden thread that goes through a lot of this thinking and activity, and that really summed up for me what you write about, going from the Garden City movement right through to the kind of municipal utopianism of the 1930s, and then beyond that to the Beveridge report and to the Atlee government and the post-war housing building and the National Health Service and so on. And I'd like to focus just a little bit on housing, because it seems to me that here was attempts made to, if we could crudely say, create a new heaven on earth or build a new Jerusalem. With housing was such a critically important issue for cities, particularly for working class people, living in slums. And actually, as we come to the present day, the housing crisis we face now demands that kind of new thinking as well. But let's start with the Garden City movement, the idea of the country and the city. And we know about Ebenezer Howard, we know well, but you write about Henrietta Barnett, and I thought this was someone, again, another woman, a woman utopian thinker. And we'll talk also about Ada Salter as well in a moment. But what did they do? What was their aims in terms of building utopian ideas into cities?
Well, yeah, it was very much part of that. You mentioned Ebenezer Howard. It's very much part of that. I guess there was a sort of group of movements that were going on sort of towards the late 19th century, which was about how to really renovate urban life in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, basically. And so one effort was to, in some sense, bring the country into the city, to try and somehow mingle the two in a way that would create a new kind of city that would be healthier and more morally uplifting and spiritually uplifting. So Ebenezer Howard tried to do this famously at Letchworth. And Henrietta Barnett was sort of working around the same time. So she, slightly different model, but in a way, looking towards the same sort of problem. So she was the founder of Hampstead Garden Suburb in North London. So the idea of a garden suburb that would combine the best of the city and the country, wouldn't necessarily be a completely self-contained city in the way that Ebenezer Howard tried to create at Letchworth, but that would create a new kind of suburb on the edge of London that would be a contrast to, of course, at that time there were lots of suburbs growing, but they were often sort of these developer-built, commercially built suburbs that were sprawling without much sense of shape, and were sort of, monotonous and so on. So she was trying to do something that was very different, that was a green, kind of holistically planned suburb that would bring in different social classes, that would have working class people, middle class people living together. And she extraordinarily managed to sort of create this suburb close to Hampstead Heath.
I mean, one of the things that you mentioned there was something I wanted to ask you about, in this idea of utopian places bringing together different groups of people, different social classes of people. And this is what Bevan wanted to do with council housing, in that much famous quote about, the butcher lives next to the doctor and so on. And this idea that people can live together, I thought was very significant, that it was in that thinking at that time, as well as much later on, 40 or 50 years later on, when Bevan was building the council estates and so on, post Second World War.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a really key, that's a really key element of Utopia, has been, that goes back, as I say, further back in history, of classlessness, of doing away with inequality, and creating a different type of sort of reciprocity and connection between people. And that goes back to, well, I mean, it goes back a very long way, but in terms of some of the stories in the book, I mean, Robert Owen, his idea of creating, and initially his idea was to create kind of colonies for the poor, but that actually eventually expanded into, let's create something that brings together everybody and actually creates a new kind of society. So that, and then in some of the sort of utopian theorists like Charles Fourier, the idea of the phalanstery, where these sort of class divisions would be sort of melted down and so on, new kinds of groups would arise and new kinds of solidarity. So that's a really key part. And yes, and the council housing push again, which is sort of now forgotten about, because as I talk about in the book, we sort of lost faith in that vision, and council housing then moved into this sort of idea of residualization, as they called it. So giving council houses were basically a kind of social ambulance type thing, people who were, right at the bottom of the of society, had some sort of were not able to participate in some way, so to the very sort of lowest strata. But that, originally it was about bringing different classes together and creating a new kind of society, new kinds of solidarities. So that's a really, an important thread in the story, I think. Yeah.
I mean, we did a big project on the council estate in 2019 for the centenary of the first estate in Bristol, and we commissioned a group of writers to write about growing up in council housing, and their experience was generally the one you've referred to there. And I grew up in council housing, and I knew that it was you were regarded as a second-class citizen, actually, I think, if you grew up in council. But, when they were built, they were homes fit for heroes, was the slogan at the time. They were, for middle-class people as well as working-class people. They were often built with communities in mind. So the growth of the public library system, for example, in Bristol, often went alongside council estates. As council estates were built, you had public libraries built and community centres and so on. Now, they didn't all work perfectly, and there's some terrible examples of planning in Bristol, which we talked about then and we'll be doing more work on in the future. But their hope was there, that this was housing, good housing, secure tenancies, for communities to develop and for families to be built and for people to be able to work and have some security of tenure over their heads, really.
Exactly. And that sort of sense of that in that earlier period you mentioned, that sense of pride, actually. I mean, you in one of the I look at this topic through the lens of Bertolt Lubetkin, who's this very sort of visionary architect in London, and he built some very, very high quality estates. But the hearing the people who moved into them talk about their sense of pride and how extraordinary it was to live in such such accommodation. Lubetkin famously said, nothing is too good for ordinary people or working people, and so really try to do that, and this sense of excitement and pride in now living somewhere like that. And we sort of think, I think, through the 80s and the sort of rundown of the estates, we sort of forget, if you're of a particular age, my sort of age, we forget what that would have been like.
I mean, Lubetkin was an important figure in all of this, as you mentioned, and this period in the 20s, particularly in the 1930s, when you had this growth of, practical utopia. You had municipal utopia. You had, the Finsbury Health Centre, the precursor to the NHS, and this remarkable Ada Salter, as she became, and the work that she did in Bermondsey, I thought offered very valuable lessons for today as well.
Yeah, I mean, she's part of that same, in a way, part of the same, push for social housing. Yes, very much part of this new front of sort of radical local governments that sort of emerged in London in sort of early 20th century. And yes, she tried to build actually a little miniature kind of small, I mean, the thing that she's really famous for and that still exists in Bermondsey, this small little garden city, just back from the river in this very gritty industrial suburb of Bermondsey. So that's really, that's the non-retreating version of utopia, not trying to retreat from the city and create a rural idyll somewhere, but say, okay, let's see what we can do here among the factories and the cranes and the docks in Bermondsey and create this little small garden city and other developments as well. But she was an absolutely extraordinary example of sort of very much practical utopianism, so pushing stuff through committees against people opposing what she was trying to do, and pushing it through and getting her vision actually built on the ground, was an extraordinary achievement.
And I thought also the way that they integrated film in their work. I mean, there's a wonderful picture you have in the book of a street full of people watching this mobile cinema, and these were films about health issues, weren't they? And about things like that to make their communities operate better. It's
exactly. I mean, in a way, it comes back to what I was saying earlier about it's not just about design; it's about how you create an ethos. If you want to use the word, propaganda or ideology, I don't mind. That's fine by me. But in a way, that's what they were trying to do was to create these facilities, but also to, in a way, create a new kind of citizen of London, using these sort of ideological tools. So they had, the film vans, sort of literature they distributed in libraries, all sorts of things, and did create this kind of Bermondsey ethos. They called it the Bermondsey Revolution and so on. So it was an extraordinary moment actually in the history.
Where are we with Utopia now, do you think? You talk about the growth of protest movements, the Reclaim the Streets. We've had, the Lefebvre's Right to the City and so on. Lots of people have written about particularly cities and utopian thinking. But where do you think we are now with utopian and cities?
I think a lot of these strands that we are talking about are still very much sort of in play. I mean, I guess that's what I was trying to do in the book, was to say that there's this sort of imaginative lineage out there that is available to us. So a lot of the things that Barnett was talking about, Spence was talking about, many of the other movements in the book I think still speak to the sorts of things that we're worried about today. So whether it's how we use, that you just mentioned there, Lefebvre, how we use space in the city. So the sort of pseudo privatization of a lot of London, and probably other cities, probably Bristol as well. How that has sort of impinged on the way that we use the city and how we relate to each other. I mean, I think that's something that's sort of been thought about through the tradition, and that we're still concerned about today and worried about today. And the other big one, I mean, that you mentioned earlier, Andrew, of course, is housing.
Yeah.
And which of course there's a huge amount of thinking going on there. And in the again, in this tradition, housing is really so much at the centre of what goes on in utopian thinking. So even if you go back all the way to Thomas More, I mean, one of the first things you hear about when you visit his island is what houses look like.
Yeah.
They're exchanged by lots.
Yeah.
Every 10 years. They've got these sort of communal gardens at the back. The doors don't have locks, so everyone can come in and out and visit each other and so on. So it's this really powerful sense of kind of how housing, again, connects to the kind of ethos that we live by, how we relate to each other, and that housing is a really deep part of the social infrastructure. And again, I think that was lost with the sort of turning away from social housing and council estates. So all that stuff, I think people are still, that's very much alive in the debate and in how we think about how urbanists are thinking about the city. So yes, I think Utopia is very much here and alive, and a sort of tradition that offers us many tools and many sort of points of inspiration.
And when you think about the things that affect cities now, housing is one. The transport is another. Over them all, inequality is climate change and the environment. And you look at very contemporary movements like Extinction Rebellion as being part of this lineage, this tradition in utopian thinking.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's obviously it's taken on a new angle in the last 20 years, 30 years, or because of climate change. But again, many of the sort of strands go further back. I mean, I think that we can't really think, I don't think we'll solve climate change unless we think about how we relate to each other more broadly and how society is set up. It's not just about these sort of technical solutions. So, for example, how we think about consumption, and so on. So again, that's something that is really very much part of the tradition. I mean, Thomas More had this vision of a society of kind of ascetics that was quite a sort of anti-luxury sort of tradition. So he was very much sort of in modern terms, he'd be an anti-consumerist. So that sort of idea, how do we sort of cope with this sort of consumerist society? How are we going to solve climate change if we still pursue consumerism and so on? And then another strand of it is the sort of garden cities idea of trying to create some sort of fusion between the urban and the rural, and how we can renovate cities by bringing nature into it. So again, that's a huge part of so much of what's going on in the cities, with sort of rewilding and greening projects and so on. So again, there are threads there that sort of connect to sort of earlier thinkers, I think.
I mean, I do think there are threads, and I do think there's hope in some ways. I see this in Bristol with the greening of the city, as you mentioned, the rewilding projects. There are also tensions, as there always are in these matters. It brings me to this more general issue about progress and the notion of progress. And you write about this in the book, the work of Isaiah Berlin and Karl Popper and their criticisms of utopian ideas. And do you think we've lost, or can we regain, if we have, this idea that we can make progress and for a better city, a better world, but a better city particularly?
I think we have to. I mean, yes, I think we need to sort of in some ways go beyond and I think Utopia can help us to do this, go beyond the optimism, pessimism sort of dichotomy. where people say, "Oh, are you an optimist or a pessimist?"
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, a very sort of passive way of thinking about society in the future. It's just something that happens to us, rather than thinking about a kind of well, what some people have called sort of active hope, or how do we create our social reality, and that utopia is a powerful way, if we can get beyond thinking about it as a final blueprint, but more as a kind of process, then it's a really powerful way of moving beyond that and thinking about how we might improve cities and societies. I mean, the other problem, of course, is that we kind of lost faith in these sort of grand narratives.
Yes.
And utopia can feel like this big sort of grand narrative. So, as you mentioned, Popper and Berlin, over the 20th century, with all the sort of horrors of the 20th century, we sort of lost faith in that, and then moving into a more sort of postmodern type of society. So by the time we get to the 90s, if you think about political life in Britain in the 90s, all about sort of pragmatism and so on, no sense of wanting to be peddling these sort of grand narratives. So there are barriers to it, obstacles, but I think I really do think we need to embrace that and say, there are things that we can do, and it's really important not to not to make the perfect the enemy of the good. And this is one of the real sort of sticking points that people have with utopian thinking, is this idea, this very sort of dominant sort of perception that it's about perfection, and it's about creating sort of the end of history and the final blueprint. I think that's a huge mistake, and we need to sort of head that off in a way. And if we do, there are many parts of the tradition and many tools that we can use to do that.
I mean, I see that in ideas, like, the growing move to a 4-day week, for example, which, when you think about it, is, what they call a no-brainer in a way. No one, productivity doesn't seem to suffer, and people seem a lot happier. You see it in, you write about this, universal basic income is an older idea which has begun to take on a new relevance now. So I think there are certain projects which would be of huge benefit to cities, and to living in cities, and to life in cities, and just to people's well-being, which some have criticised as utopian in the past, when utopian is used in a negative way.
Yeah,
but nonetheless are potentially huge steps forward, really.
absolutely. I would absolutely agree with that. I think there's increasing evidence that those sorts of things would have a huge impact on people's lives. And actually, if you want to see things in a very sort of instrumental perspective of productivity, that actually might even enhance things in that area. Absolutely. And then other things in the sort of policy space, things like the 15-minute cities.
Yeah.
Another thing, again, which has created strange kind of forms of opposition, but again is about sort of trying to create this sense of the more livable neighborhoods, and as a way of creating connection and new forms of community, a really huge part of the Utopian project. So that there are these elements out there that connect to the story.
And you saw it during COVID. You write about this, and we all experienced it personally. The mutual aid that existed, even a couple of years on from COVID, my neighbourhood's WhatsApp group, we're still working together. I knew more about my neighbours through COVID and after COVID than in the 20 years I'd lived in the street. And I think, but this idea that COVID was going to deliver something, we can't go back to what we were doing, I think has worked in certain ways. The government would, I think, like us all to be back in the office 5 days a week. And, I think that's a lost hope in many ways for certain areas of work. Anyway, it can't be done for everyone, of course. But there was that chance, wasn't there, I think, of a crisis which could have led to huge change. And has perhaps led to something which is good. And that's, I think, part of the move towards, a better place in the future.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I think it was... in the book, I talk about utopian windows, like these moments, often points of crisis, where kind of utopian yearnings emerge and take on a greater sort of solidity. And I think, COVID was obviously an element of that. As you say, the mutual aid, people finding new forms of solidarity, the NHS clapping on Thursday nights, all this sort of symbolism, and people talking about not wanting to go back to the
It's
old
12 hours.
and sort of detecting new political possibilities. But of course, yeah, I mean, it's a sort of, when you look back on it, it's a bit of a mixed picture. I think these utopian windows then often they close up again, and there are some residues of them still around, as you say, but some, you look around the sort of political landscape and you think, oh, where did it go?
Yeah.
That's wanting to do things differently.
But I think this is again coming back to both what you say, the perfection is the enemy of the good is one thing, but also Ruth's idea of the steps towards utopia, the utopian thinking you go through. And indeed also I see it in how people are organizing and new forms of places where people can discuss these things. You talking about crucible of social imaginings. Toynbee Hall is one example of that in London. We nowadays call that social infrastructure, but there's a golden thread going back a long time of those things. And the more we have, the better, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today. The Infinite City, Utopian Dreams on the Streets of London is published by William Collins and is out now, and it's highly recommended. Thank you, Niall, for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Great talking to you.